speech in 3, 2, 1. An idealistic approach only makes privileged children succeed. We think that we need to protect the most vulnerable people, the poor people who are not able to achieve the most successful careers in their life. Hence, we're very proud to propose this motion. Before going on to my argument, a few setups. So what do we mean by harsh truths and realities? We mean things like job hunting process, telling children how many people, for example, apply for a job and how many people get in, how many people graduate from a certain university, and things like that. Next, we think that we're also going to include realistic career options for children. For example, going to professional schools to learn how to make a car and things like that. Next, about idealistic approaches, we think that this looks like the American dream, right? For example, telling the children effort equals, if you put a lot of effort, you can become a baseball player or you can become a doctor. We think that these top careers are what these children are going to be told are good and are what should be pursued. We think that this will be pursued in all stages of education. And though opposition may say that they can do both on their side of the house, we think that this is impossible because there's a limited amount of resources and amount of time in education where you can spend on career, right? So we think that this is going to be a debate about whether only teaching hard truth and realities and only teaching idealistic approaches, which is better. We're going to say that harsh truth and realities are going to be better for the majority of the children. Now, I have two arguments for today. One, about how poor people are going to fail, and secondly, about how we can provide better preparation for career planning. First point, about idealistic approach in career aspirations fail poor people. We think that when idealistic approaches are put, people have high expectations in career. Children are going to think, for example, that they can become an astronaut if they work hard or things like that. They think that they can do well and they believe in themselves. We think that this means that poor and rich people are going to pursue the same path because every child is told the same things, right? So because they're going to be taught about, like, the whole class is about how, like, they're amazing jobs and you can pursue them. And if the child says things like, I want to be a doctor, the teacher is going to praise them. These children are going to believe that, right? The nature of children is that they're very gullible, right? And when they're told that they can do something, we think that they are very likely to believe that and to only have that in mind, this dream bubble that they can become a really great person when they grow up. Next, what does this mean? We think that there's going to be obviously a competition in jobs once these children grow up, right? And when that happens, rich people are going to be much more advantaged than poor people. Why? Because they have much more capital, right? They have more connections to people in society, and they're also probably going to be able to go to a very prestigious university because they have the money to study, for example, outside of school, or to be able to do many activities that they can write on their resumes when they submit it to their universities. We think that this means that poor people, they have a very, very low chance of getting into the companies or getting into a profession that they wanted to go to, that they were told they can go to when they were children. We think that this means poor people are going to be in debt. And noting that these people don't already have the base to compete in society as compared to rich people, we think that this damages the early stages of life, right? We think that if these people are not in the same competition as rich people, they're going to more be satisfied because on our side of the house, they know from an early stage in life about how they can pursue a very realistic job. We think that it is too late, for example, the age of 28, to realize that the path you're pursuing for is too idealistic because your whole university career and your plan has been planned out, and it's impossible to go back to it and start over again, especially when you don't have money, especially when you're in debt from not being able to get a job. We think that this not only harms individuals, but the whole society, right? Why? Because there's going to be a social disparity, and the society will be exclusive to the poor people. The rich people are going to be able to get these jobs, but poor people will never be satisfied. And when they're told that from a young age, they're very gullible, they're very vulnerable to believe those things. We can create a society where poor people are more satisfied with their jobs because they're told what they can achieve once they become an adult. Now, second argument about better preparation for career planning. So I have three arguments, and then I'll be explaining why it is so important. One, we think that the children will be able to allocate their resources better. For example, like instead of going to a university that's not very prestigious and failing at a job interview, we think that these poor people, will be able to pursue, for example, professional schools because they'll be lowering the standard of where they can get a job, right? We think that this means that they'll be able to plan their careers at an early age from when they're a child. And for example, if you're 22 and you already have a job, you're already making cars, right? And you have the skills to do that. We think that these poor people will have much more advantage in society because they're already working. They're not in debt from pursuing a job that is very thought to be very successful. Second, we think that this means that these children are going to be able to have better choices. We think that harsh truth and realities will incentivize children to study. On their world, the teachers are providing a dream bubble, right? And they're given no realistic process as to how they can achieve that. This is exactly why children are not incentivized to study because they don't see that they're going to fail if they don't try hard. They don't know that, right? On our side of the house, because we're going to keep telling children the harsh realities of the world, how they will probably not be able to get a job unless they try very hard, we think that children, the poor children who have to get a job in the future are going to be able to start studying and are going to have an aim to what they are going to achieve in the future. On our world, because there's going to be a pressure from this information given to them, we think that they're going to be able to know how to understand how they can achieve a better career. So thirdly, we think that this means that when they have better choices, they can make a long-term plan, a whole life plan, right? Why? Because when you know the first step as a person in society, you're able to think more about when you're going to get married, when you're going to get children, things like that. Lastly, why is this important? One, we think that informed and rational decision is the important responsibility of school. We think that schools need to be a place where they show children how they can succeed in society. And secondly, we think that for poor people, the school, the public sphere is the only place where these people can get information on how they can succeed better in life, right? We think this is exactly why we need schools to tell the harsh truth and realities of the world. We're very proud to propose. Thank you.
In a way, opposition side is doing the exact same thing as these idealistic educational programs, when they're telling us that these things can happen, yet they give us absolutely no way as to how these poor kids can be successful accountants, for example. We think that in a world in which racism, sexism, and classism are entrenched, in which these poor, disprivileged children are likely to be facing incredibly uphill conditions, even if they go into these limited industries, it's much better if we just already show them the harsh reality of the industry beforehand so that they can actually choose a job that benefits them better. I'm going to be talking about 4 things in my speech. Firstly, what is the goal of education? Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the likely case regarding disprivileged children in this motion. Secondly, I'll be talking about the likely case thirdly, the likely case of idealism. And fourthly, considering the trade-off that happens. So firstly, I'm going to be talking about what is the goal of education, because I think that is something that needed to be clarified in the previous speakers. Opposition was basically incredibly unclear on what the goal of education was. I think the idea was that children should be sold their dreams because dreams are inherently important. But I don't think that an inherent importance of dreams is anything tangible that we should value in this debate, right? The goal of education, especially career education, needs to be pragmatic. That is to say, we are actually having these children make informed choices and reducing future regrets. This means that it should be a results-oriented thing, that even if these children have dreams and if they are intrinsically valuable to some extent, we think those should be deprioritized if those children have very little possibility of actually achieving those dreams, as Hitoha has already laid out in her debate. We also think that in this case, a certain amount of intervention into what we call free will is necessary, right? In order to make sure that these children do not regret these things in the future. An analogy would be for example, standardized curriculums, because even if these children, for example, you want to focus specifically on an art curriculum, we force them to take other subjects as well, because we recognize the possibility that they might fail, that oftentimes the free will that they have at a young age is not exactly perfect. In this case, that means that, for example, even if these children might drink the Kool-Aid, that they can be a very successful musician due to an idealized program, we think that government has a responsibility to kind of fix that, lower their expectations, right? Because we as I said, we live in an unequal society, and I think having that amount of intervention is what is going to reduce future regrets, as the goal of education should be. With that said, moving on to the second issue, which what is the likely case regarding disprivileged children in this motion? Opposition basically laid out that it's going to lead to an abundance of over-pessimism and defeatism, that children are never going to get a job, and that is basically like shutting off their future possibilities. 3 things to say to this, right? Firstly is that it was incredibly assertive to begin with to assume that harsh realities are going to be, are going to lead to defeatism to begin with. Secondly, I think the truth is not always pessimistic. Like a lot of jobs have low starting salaries, but they have high potential. Things like trade schools, right? If you become an engineer, you can often make a lot more money and have a lot more stable income than, for example, than being a musician, for example. So we think that the truth is not always as pessimistic as they display it to be. The actual likely case is that it's going to be a realistic possibility for these children that might not be like their ideal job, but it's still something that they likely enjoy and that they would likely have a good future in. The third thing I like to say to this is that if the truth is so harsh in these industries that it makes these children defeatist to begin with, then they should not go into these industries because they are likely to be set up to fail. They are likely to be in incredibly entrenched conditions. For example, a disabled child should not go into an industry that has an absolutely terrible track record for the accommodation of disabled people, because what the likely scenario is that they're going to be facing things like microaggression on a daily basis. And at the point in which they realize that like the industry is so terrible for them that they have no choice but to get out, they have already invested a significant amount of resources. There's an incredible sunk cost in that, and that even if they try to find a different career, they often cannot because they have wasted all their time on an industry that did not benefit them. They probably have not had that much opportunity to advance their career, right. And as a result, the opportunities for upwards mobility become much lower. So the conclusion of this is that basically, if the reality is that harsh, they should not go into these industries to begin with. But I think the likely scenario that we are going to be showing these children is that there are industries that may not seem so perfect at first, but are actually quite realistic for it, especially if you come from a disprivileged sector. And I think that is the kind of realistic opportunity that is going to be able to give them a better future in the world. Now, moving on, what is the likely case of idealism? Opposition's main case was that idealism leads to monopolization of positions by the wealthy. 2 things to say to this. Firstly is that this is symmetric on both sides because Hitoha already told you that even if there are more like poor kids going into the entry-level jobs like Goldman Sachs, for example, these organizations are inherently racist, classist, and sexist to the extent that the people at the top are usually white men. So we don't think that the monopolization by the wealthy of these powerful positions is something that is like significantly different across both sides. But secondly, I think that even if opposition had the incredibly noble idea of reducing classism by enforcing idealism, we don't think this is a justified trade-off to begin with, because individuals should not be sacrificed for the purpose of some kind of higher social purpose, right? When we think about the fact that these children are having their careers, are throwing away their careers and throwing away their lives, I think at that point it is much better and it's much more in the interest of education to make sure that they have good lives rather than focusing on a larger social purpose. I'd also like to talk about like why it's not worth it, even if certain members of these disprivileged minorities do manage to succeed. But before that, yes.
On your side, how do you change the social norm in which minorities can't go to certain industries that discriminate them? Like, how do you lessen this discrimination?
Okay, I don't think that's different on both sides, because, for example, we can have things like anti-discrimination regulation. That does not have to happen by having these children go into these entry-level jobs. I think that actually comes from lawmakers, for example. So I don't think that's a relevant case to begin with. Why is the trade-off not worth it, even if certain people succeed? 3 things to say. First of all, even if certain people succeed, even if a minority ends up becoming the president of Goldman Sachs, for example, why is it not worth it? A is that a much larger population is not going to succeed, and as a result, that is reinforcing the cycle of poverty. So we think that on a metric of like quantity, we win on that point, right? But B, we think the people that succeed have already probably succeeded at a cost of a shit ton of mental stress. For example, tolerating workplace microaggression in the sexist industries, going to these like white universities that have incredible discrimination. Oftentimes it's not worth it. So even if they are successful, we think that they would have been successful in less racist industries. C is that these people that succeed are probably incredibly ambitious and skilled to begin with. So even if they see the harsh truth on our side, we think they're still going to probably choose these exclusive paths. The delta, as I said, is what I said in A about the people that do not have the ambition and ability, but are still deceived into going down these paths. So finally, I'm going to be talking about the trade-off. Like, even if some disprivileged children are forced to give up their dreams under our side, we think that is a worthy trade-off for future stable success. Because A, a certain extent of intervention is already necessary, and secondly, because dreams change anyways, right? It's better to tell them the harsh reality first before they have to change their dream after they have already invested a lot of opportunity cost. All in all, we say that people should be realistic, and this is how we get them to do it. I'll proud to post. Start. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Government wins because we gave you a world in which minorities can succeed at a much larger percentage than the 2% worldview of side opposition. Ultimately, we say that showing them realistic alternatives to a future in which the world is incredibly entrenched is much more likely to give them the stable future that both sides want. All in all, proud to propose. I'm going to be talking about two things in my reply speech. Firstly, which side is more likely to make children succeed? Secondly, engaging with the idea of the narratives that are propagated as a result of this motion. Firstly, which side is more likely to make children succeed? From Prime Minister, side government laid out a world in which these harsh realities exist and children have nothing that they can do about it. However, we also told you that there are good alternatives to this system that should be told in school. The status quo, as exemplified by side opposition, is that these poor kids, due to the narratives that exist in this world, think that they can only be garbage collectors, think that they can only be farmers because that is the thing that their family has been doing for centuries. We want to change that by giving them feasible and realistic opportunities like vocational school or skill-based industries like nursing or dentistry, that kind of thing. Opposition Whip said that this is the lowest of the low of the hierarchical pyramid. This is an incredibly classist assumption that does not correspond with reality at all. We think people that go to vocational schools actually end up making a good amount of money that is actually a very stable source of income that is not contingent on them being dependent upon racist structures, like, for example, the Goldman Sachs hiring team. As a result, we think that in these industries, they're much more likely to be successful. Now, DLO and Opposition Whip also push the idea that these children will not be interested in these kinds of things. This is not true, right? Because we think that the jobs such as nursing or dentistry can also be much more interesting than being an investment banker. But also, we think that it's much more interesting when it seems like a realistic possibility instead of a pipe dream. When we say to these little black kids that, for example, you had somebody that was a graduate of your school that was also like black, but they were able to find financial success and stability in this kind of field. We think that is much more likely to be a tangible and visceral thing for them. Therefore, they are going to be more realistic, as opposed to being shown an idealistic world of like investment banking, in which that seems incredibly unrealistic and also incredibly exclusionary to begin with. So we think all in all, we say that they are much more likely to be interested under our side. Now, even if they're not initially interested, we still think that's fine because education should be results oriented. The ultimate goal of education is that we make sure that these children do not regret their future decisions by giving them the information, right? So even if they're not as interested as they would be in being like an artist, for example, we think that is still worth it if that means that they were able to create good futures for themselves, even if that was not the thing that interested them most. On opposition, they gave us this idea of how idealism makes them successful. They had absolutely no process as to how this would happen. What kind of idealism are they going to be giving to these children? How are they going to be changing these systems so that these children can succeed? And they think this ambiguity itself is problematic, and that ambiguity is never going to provide a sharp incentive for these children to try to succeed, contrasted with the idea of real success that we gave you under our side. At best, they say that a small minority is going to be able to get massive financial success in the upper echelon of society. But from DPM, we've told you that this is a symmetric thing because these super ambitious people will try hard even with these harsh realities. And secondly, even if the small minority gets massive financial success, that's not worth sacrificing the majority of these populations by selling them a pipe dream that they cannot actually succeed on. As a result, we think our side is much more likely to make children succeed because we give them a realistic alternative to the pipe dreams proposed by opposition's side. Second, briefly engaging with the idea of the narratives. Opposition said that telling these kids harsh realities means that when we give these minorities idealistic reality, we tell them that minorities can be successful as well. Note that this is entirely contingent on the practical success of minorities in these fields, which they have not proved given the characterization of these fields as exclusionary, as we've already told you. But we think that even if it is true that this idealism spreads the idea that minorities can be successful as well, it's probably not worth the incredible mental burden and career derailing that the majority of these individuals have to go through in order to propagate these narratives. Education should not be primarily about changing the social narrative as it exists right now. The primary goal should be bettering the life of the student that is right in front of you. And that looks like giving them the road to a vocational school or a university with a higher acceptance rate. All in all, we say that is realistic success, and that is what we propose.